to dive into another episode of Running with Scissors, the podcast that helps you understand who and what you truly are in the world. Buckle up as we unpack strategies to unlock your full potential so you can stop running with scissors and get the most out of your life, work, and relationships. Let's go!
I love that intro.
What's up? You like it now? Last episode, you didn't like it.
No, I didn't say I didn't like it. I wanted to hear her voice more than the music. But
I know
I
have to make that tweak still. I'm gonna do it. Don't worry. Next episode of Running with Scissors will have a new, slightly different intro. So if you're listening, see if you can pick it up. But anyway, we're here to run with scissors today. We're talking about traits. We are diving deep on the HumanOp technology over the next several episodes, at least. Really understanding how you can get into, use the app, optimize yourself over the next 90 days. And today we're talking about traits. So Wei, before we dive into traits, why don't we talk about what they are, what the language is, why they're named weird things? Give me the high level of traits.
Yeah, so the science behind traits is physical traits, right? Characteristics. And so if we understand physical law to a certain degree, we know that anything physical is governed by gravitational law. It's physics at play. And since Dr. Zana was building this technology based on the foundation of what is the part of human beings that changes the least over time, barring physical trauma or extreme type of weight gain or weight loss, it's our physical traits, right? And that provides the anchor. In fact, when we look at a human being, and even before human beings had language, we looked at this foundation of physical traits to understand, is this someone that we can connect with? Before modern language was invented, human beings connected with each other that way. And that's why over the nomadic times, when people migrated away from being nomadic, right, we realized that everybody kind of settled into being similar. That's why you see different ethnicities, which was the byproduct of human beings being nomadic and understanding how to tribe with people who they can naturally get along with based on their physical traits. So this is why the world is the way it is. When we moved away from the nomadic times, and modern language is invented where we didn't need to do that anymore, everybody just kind of settled into wherever they landed. And so going back to that understanding of what human beings did since the beginning of time, traits represent the unique foundation of our natural potential, right? So a little bit of the geekery behind it was the genius behind what Dr. Zana created 20 years ago, or started to create 20 years ago, of researching and finding the norms and data around this. She was able to isolate and put into subset and categories different subsets of characteristic traits that every human being shares. And depending of the volume of expression, like how significant, and you can tell by just looking at another human being, just ask yourself, well, when I look at this human being, what stands out the most? The one that stands out the most, or the features that stand out the most, that stick out the most, that help you remember this human being, those are what we call the higher volume characteristics. So within each of those subsets of characteristics, we've also, through our research, identified certain behavior characteristics that are common within more pronounced physical characteristics of human being. Much like if you look at a race car, you know it's designed for a race car for a specific reason, right? Similarly, we see the same thing. We see when we look at athletes, we can tell who can run fast, who can be that brick wall that you don't want to like run into, right? Those are the types of things. And yeah, a lot of you say, well, that's obvious. Well, nature is obvious. It's human being that tries to ignore the obvious, thinking that we could change nature. That's where we get ourselves a little bit stuck, right? So the high level overview of basically this: we start with traits and we help people understand how to master the understanding of how to move from one authentic trait to another throughout their day, to make sure that they get the most out of every single day, most out of their life, and more importantly, maintain energy levels at a very high level by just knowing what trait is authentically where they should be.
Yeah, and I want to dive into all of that and explore it. A couple of the questions that have come up to me this week when I'm talking with people, I'm talking to hiring managers, I'm talking to business leaders. We have our HumanOp app. It's in the App Store. If you haven't downloaded it yet, please go do that. Search HumanOp in the App Store. There is also a link below this recording. But also our business platform, Maestro.
Mhm.
One of the common questions that comes up when I explain what we do and how we do it, like you just did, is how do we not discriminate? You're talking about how someone physically looks in a hiring context in the workplace. That is the most common question. So why don't you explain that angle
Mhm.
up? Because yes, it is how you physically appear in the world and the volumes of traits,
Mhm.
looking and judging how people look. So just dissect that dynamic for me.
Yeah, the whole concept of vilifying discrimination and judging a book by its cover is a byproduct of what modern language has helped distort. Um, in an effort to manipulate and control, I'll say that now, the powers that may be over time after modern language was invented had realized that language was so powerful that it could steer human beings away from their natural selves. But in order to maintain their control over that, so to speak, we have to introduce and vilify our ability to distinguish through observation of nature, right? Now we see the same thing happens in nature where zebras and lions and antelopes and tigers, they do discriminate, they stay away from each other. They don't do it in a judgmental way. Nobody says they're wrong for doing it. What makes it wrong, or the term of the negative connotation around discrimination, is just the years of societal and cultural conditioning. The reality is, to truly honor another human being is to objectively, and this is what our mission is to bring back the objectivity of recognizing the unique differences everybody has. Because how do you not discriminate, so to speak? Because if you look around the room and look around everybody that you come across today, I mean, if you're listening to this right now, I challenge you for the rest of the day, go around and see if you can find a carbon copy of yourself. No, every human being is different. Nature gave us clues there. We just ignored that and became a little bit too big for our britches and became arrogant, saying, yeah, we're better than nature. You know, we'll make it wrong that nature is showing us the differences between each of ourselves, right? And so then we put this lens of judgment and bias because it helps us not to face the mirror that what we forgotten to see, forgotten to understand, and forgotten to be honorably objective when it comes to our fellow human beings, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's a challenge that we've encountered a few times working in corporate America with certain people who are particularly charged with, like, well, then you're judging me. It's like, actually, it's quite the opposite. We're using this tool to eliminate judgment, because when I tell you about you, are you telling me that it's not you? Well, no, I just don't. You don't want someone else to see you for you, but rather what you think you want them to see you as. Because when someone gets triggered about being discriminated in an objective way, what they're really saying is, I don't know and I don't see what I am, and I don't want someone else to see who I am better before I can see what I am. And so I think the core goal is this, is that what we can facilitate is first and foremost for every human being to go to the app, download the app, get the results, and see themselves for the very first time without anybody else around, and then take the steps to re-engage and reconnect with your true self, so that charge of being discriminated and whatever the case may be will no longer be there. Because not only will, if it's in alignment with you, you can accept it and say, great, you see me. And two, if they don't see you in the proper way, you can now objectively articulate to them your true self and what you're really all about.
Yeah, it's interesting when you go through it for the first. I'm thinking back to the first time where you actually told me who I am better than I knew who I was, and it's unnerving, but it's interesting at the same time because you say you see these things. The biggest thing I see about you is X, and you go through the list. when a computer does that, it's even a little bit scarier because it's like based on the questions that were asked, you're like, hang on, first of all, how did you come to this conclusion? You're a
Right.
psychic computer. Um, but then the next question is, okay, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
How do I step into this regal, absorptive, energetic trait, whatever it may be for you?
Right.
And how do I optimize my life based on that? Because I don't want to be something else. Now that I know who I am, what I am, and how I should operate,
Right.
how do I do that so I don't drain my energy, like you said before? So
Yeah.
let's go through this then with the 7 traits that are available on the app. It's very rare that anybody would see all 7 of them on their app. So why don't we start with talking about that, and then we'll talk about how you understand and step into what does
Mhm.
display on your app.
Yeah. So like you were saying, there are 7 fundamental categorical traits that every human being has potential access to. And depending on the volume of the physical expression and how much you are stepping into that, that's another piece too. See, what the traits and what the technology reveals is your natural potential more than anything. Now, as we all know, everybody's always on this journey of stepping into their full potential, as we hear often, right? And so a lot of times in the very beginning, especially somebody who's being introduced to this for the very first time, they may find like, well, I felt like there was more to me than this. It's like, there is. Here's the interesting thing about human potential is that though our technology can identify human beings' potential, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are actually fully stepping into it. Of course, when we look at the more complexity and go down a little bit deeper, we can see that this is what's happening and why they're not fully stepping into that potential. So you'll see that as time goes on, as someone becomes more and more optimized, you'll see more and more traits start to get a little bit more volume because they were being underutilized over the course of their life, right? So there are 7 fundamental traits that represent a subset of physical characteristics in every human being. So all of our practitioners who are trained in this on a very deep level, not only are we trained to understand the algorithm and understand the raw data of the results, but we're also, as a byproduct, learn how to see the world again for how nature wanted us to see the world. We can see other human beings and be able to, on the fly, understand how to communicate with that human being in the most optimal way. But there's 7, and they have different categories. And so if you happen to have your app and you're listening to this at the same time, it'd be kind of cool to have it open. So as I'm talking about your traits, you can kind of say, oh, okay, cool. Now I understand a little bit more, because there's so much information, and some of the feedback that we've been getting, I'm sure you've been getting, is like, now what? There's so much information. What do I do with all this, right? And believe it or not, we pared back a lot just to get this app out there. So there's more to come. So this is infinitely scalable in terms of value that we can add in there. But for now, there's going from top to bottom is like there's regal, there's energetic, and there's absorptive, there's romantic, there's sympathetic, and there's perceptive, and there's effervescence, right? All of these represents an aspect or physical aspect or characteristics of human beings that are grounded in gravity. The only one that is not grounded in gravity and represents more of an ethereal nature of human beings, which is represented through energy, vibe, whatever you want to call it, is the effervescent trait. Okay. But that's a necessary component as well, because it's kind of in the center of it all and holds everything together. It's the one trait that is kind of ephemeral and ethereal all at the same time. But anyway, each of these traits fall into one of 3 categories. They're either a seeing trait, a doing trait, or a processing trait. Okay. And it's exactly how it sounds. Having authentic access to certain traits that are seeing traits gives you an innate natural ability to either, because there's 2 types of seeing traits. The regal is a seeing trait, the sympathetic is a seeing trait, but they see the world in a different way. The regal, which is where the natural born leader lives, sees the world in a panoramic, like a king would, looking over its kingdom, or a queen over the queendom. They would actually have a panoramic, big picture seeing capability. Literally, if you want someone who is able to see the bigger picture of things, it is pretty important that you make sure, especially if you're having them for a role in a position in a company, you make sure they have enough volume of access to that regal trait. Now, what's the difference between that and the sympathetic, which is also a seeing trait? A sympathetic seeing trait is more situational, okay? Think of, say, like a mama bear looking after a cub. They're not thinking big picture. They're not doing a panoramic seeing. They're seeing situationally what's immediately in front, right? And so if you want someone that is good at that instead of the big picture type of seeing, then you actually make sure that that person has authentic access to that sympathetic, right? There's two types of doing traits, and it's exactly what they're responsible for. People who have access, authentic, and enough volume to accessing the energetic trait or the romantic trait, both, which doesn't sound like a doing trait, but I can explain more about that later. They are naturally designed to do. We're talking about doing things, taking action on things, getting things done. It's funny because we've worked with so many different types of businesses, and sometimes like offices where the owners are like frustrated because nothing's ever getting done, and then we use the technology to help the business owner understand their staff. And there was one client that we had when he basically realized the only person with a doing trait in his company was him. And everybody else had seeing and thinking traits as their most prominent traits. And so he said, oh, well, that makes sense. So instead of being mad, he realized he literally brought in people who were not doers, but were really good strategists, really good planners or thinkers, and really good situational awareness type of people. But they weren't really good at doing. So they could do in a moment, in a pinch, but they couldn't do it long term. It wasn't sustainable, right? And that's another thing, that what we're saying here is that, let's say you have some traits, and then let's say you don't have a natural propensity to be a leader, or your natural propensity to be a big time doer, right? There's the two types of doing: is overtly doing and doing behind the scenes. Like people with the romantic trait like to do things behind the scene. It doesn't mean that you can't learn to do that. And because human beings have blended so much over the generations, over the last 1.8 million years, almost everybody has access to a little bit of everything. So that means there's pros and cons to that. The pros is that, great, we have the flexibility of being able to learn how to do pretty much anything if we just put our mind to it. Doesn't mean we're going to be really good at it, and doesn't mean it's sustainable. The key thing is, what can we do as human beings that is sustainable long term? Understanding your traits will help you eliminate the stress and the danger of burnout by simply understanding what traits you should really be owning and utilizing for your day-to-day activities, whether it be in work or in life. Because people talk about burnout all the time with work, but trust me, you can get burnout with life as well if you create and pick a lifestyle that isn't in alignment with your traits, right? Processing traits, there's three types of processing. There's the absorptive trait, which is about the archiver and about absorbing information, exactly what it sounds like. The perceptive trait is hyper-perceptive, one of the faster processing traits, because it's very quick to identify what's not working. It's very agile, very adaptable. So if you need someone in your organization, or you want somebody in your life that is agile, adaptable, quick, clever, witty, that type of thing, the perceptive trait is probably something that you want to look for as a trait that is authentic for that person. And the last processor is the effervescence, as if you remember, the only one that's not grounded in gravity, and that one is the fastest processor. That being said, because it's not grounded in gravity, it is so fast sometimes it's not able to hold on to the processing, the ideas or the downloads or the brilliance that comes through. And it sometimes becomes a little ephemeral. Those with the effervescent trait, and if you're listening to this and you happen to have it, then you'll know what I'm talking about. You get so excited, you're in that part of you, and then you're talking about things, and then you totally lose your train of thought and it's gone, right? I have a lot of volume in that effervescent trait, and that's why I have note takers on my phone. I have notepads on everywhere I go. Any possible way I can capture what I want. I have microphones everywhere in my house.
Keep a notebook handy.
Yeah, keep a notebook handy, so that, and never trust and say, if you have a large volume in your effervescent, I'll tell you this right now. Every time I said, oh, I'll remember this, I'll just kind of dial it in and stuff like that. Nope, it's gone. Right? So it's not that you can't trust yourself. It's about understanding the trait that you're in that moment and whether or not it has the ability to retain that. Now, if you're in your absorptive trait and you recognize you're in your absorptive trait at that moment when you're bringing in this information, then you're going to be okay, because the absorptive trait is the one that is able to archive in, bring it in like a sponge, process it, and then put it away in a mental library that gives you access to it later. Okay, so these are the 7 fundamental traits that everybody has a unique combination of. There's a whole subset of volumes and everything. So even though someone may have the same traits, the volumes determine the unique nature and what is prioritized. And that's why when you are using the app, we remind you every single day from morning, noon to night, just like, hey, it's morning right now. You should do your best to be in this part of you, this trait of yours. And then in noontime or during the daytime, it'll remind you of what trait to be. And we do it every single day because we know that, yeah, we could tell you once, but this is kind of a new language. Like you were saying, unique language, the vernacular is a little different. Why is that? Because we spent years figuring out what is the most representative and the most objective in terms of ways to describe the natural propensity of a human characteristic from one trait to another, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating to see it come to life in a person and to see them go, oh yeah, no, I do exhibit that trait, or I totally get what you're saying there.
Yeah.
But you said the word recognition, or you said recognize, but I want to talk about the recognition of what trait you're in the moment, because that I think is one of the bigger learning curves when you
Right.
get introduced to the technology. Is even though the app will prompt you 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, like you said, it's that recognition of in the moment. Okay, where am I? What does that look like? How am I exhibiting that for my own unique self?
Right.
And then we could also talk about shifting gears later into the correct trait or the optimal trait for the moment. But why don't we talk about recognizing these 7 traits for ourselves, and how do we do that in real time?
Yeah. So if you were to look at your HumanOp results, in the core in the core stats section, it will show you your top 3 traits, and that's typically kind of where you naturally will biorhythmically flow throughout the day, unless life is happening and then you have to shift to a different gear out of necessity. But it's one of those things where I know, like when people get their results, I mean, there's like an hour worth of information and data that videos and information to articulate that, right?
No, there's like a
If you're
day's worth.
really,
Let's
huh?
be real. There's like a day's worth of information.
There's more than that if you really kind of go down the rabbit hole and stuff like that, especially when you start to have conversations with Hyde to kind of like learn more about details and everything like that. One of the best ways to learn more about and contextually have Hyde help have support around that is to ask questions to Hyde about what is this activity and how do I use this activity to stay in my regal trait, for example, right? So let's talk about each trait so that people can understand. When you look at the video that Lisa has done for every single person, in terms of when you get your results, you can watch the video that goes deep into understanding each specific trait. Highly recommend to go through that. I know in this day and age, everybody's got better things to do than to understand themselves better, because they prioritize everybody else outside of them. It's kind of a sad thing. Huh?
Do you have better things to do than truly understand yourself? I don't know. You're going to really have to convince me.
I know. I mean, in our world, there's no better time spent than to deepen your mastery of self, right? Because when you master yourself, you show up in the world in a better way, which then impacts everybody that you love and care about anyway. I literally had this conversation the other day where someone was a little bit criticizing the fact that, yeah, nobody really has time to go through their results and everything like that. And it's like, but this is about them. Do you know what that tells me? When someone isn't willing to take the time to deepen their understanding of self, that they put themselves so low on the totem pole of importance in life, right? Out of whatever belief systems that by society and culture or family has placed on them, that they're literally martyring themselves for the sake of whatever else they think is more important than understanding themselves. Think of the ripple effects of what happens when someone takes the time to master themselves and show up themselves consistently in a world that in the world in a better way. Because let's look at the physics of it all. When someone is operating in an optimal fashion, there is a higher frequency output of energy, of decision making, of tonality in their voice, and just kind of their perspectives on everything in life, right? They're more optimized, then they tend to be more optimistic, right? If that's one of their drivers. And so what happens is that when you don't show up, I mean, think about this. If like parents were to think about this for a moment, it's like, what happens when you're having a bad day? It was a long day. You're totally tired and burnt out. And then you find yourself not intentionally snapping at your kids, realizing that they didn't do something worth snapping to, but it's because of your state of existence. You take that and you augment that out to how people are going through life right now, not prioritizing themselves, thinking that they're prioritizing other people and doing them a favor. When you show up in a, excuse my French, a half-ass way in the world, you're going to give half-ass support. You're going to get half-ass giving love and care to the ones you love and care about. So the question is it truly about taking care of others because you're giving them half-ass love, half-ass care, right? So the whole paradigm shift right now that we're hoping to inspire and we're wanting to inspire and creating a tool to facilitate that is like, take an hour out, dive in deep, take notes, really understand yourself, ask questions, ask Haida for support, and then you'll just show up better. And the byproduct of that, it's a boomerang effect. When you show up better for others in the world, in your workplace, at home, or with your kids, or with just strangers in general, it boomerangs back and supports you, right? You give to get. I learned that from my aunt, who said, even though she was struggling every morning at the restaurant when she first immigrated here, and they were like totally broke and poor, but they were just struggling to get by. Every morning, she still made a big old, beef and broccoli. She had a Chinese restaurant, beef and broccoli dish to give to the homeless, right? Every morning, she would do that every morning. Years, decades later, she's continues to be one of the wealthiest, abundant relative in that side of the family because all that she's done. And then when my uncle passed away, they didn't have a room big enough to fill all the people who came to honor his contributions to the world, the foundations he started, all those different things, right? And all that starts from what? Showing up in the most optimized way. Yes, giving, but prioritizing your well-being, your understanding of self, showing up fully as yourself in order to create this ripple effect of optimal existence, right? I know we kind of went off track on there, but
yeah, a little tangent. That's okay. Because that's a powerful example, and two powerful examples of how you can be your authentic self and still take care of so many other people. And like you said, we have it backwards. You actually have to be your authentic self, and you have to be optimized in order to truly step into that to that magnitude.
Right.
Anybody can give a $5 bill on the street, but to really leave a legacy and live outside of what you're capable of, you have to be optimized. So yes, we did get off track. I want to do this actually. I'm going to go while you're talking about recognizing what trait you are in the moment. I'm going to go type in hi and ask it for one tip of how I can be optimized today. And we'll see what it says when you're done. I'm curious.
Yeah.
And as you're listening, you can do the same thing.
Yeah, as you're listening, you could do the same thing. Just pull out your app. But yeah, what I was saying is like, take the time to go into the results that are going to be there 24/7 about each of your authentic traits. Really learn to understand that, right? Again, regal is when you know you're in your regal trait because that's where the benevolent king or queen lives. When the part of you is acting in or behaving in such a way where like, what is in the greatest good for all, right? And what also lives there is the need to create order. If you think about a king or queen or anything like that, the need to create order and structure so that the entire kingdom can operate smoothly, right? if you actually have a regal trait, then you'll find yourself when you're in that part of you during the day, if it's one of your top 3, you'll notice there's a part of the day where it's a lot easier for you to think big picture or see the big picture, right? So step into a place of natural leadership, and think about, like, what in a benevolent way. Well, what's next? What's next today, tomorrow, next week, next month? And every trait has those unique characteristics. For example, the energetic trait, which is the right next to the regal trait, okay, that's the doer, right? But built in that, the type of doing that it does, it's the taskmaster. It's the person that could put their head down A to B the most efficient way and fastest way to get it done. It's very different from the other doer trait and the romantic trait. But this trait is also, with that, there's a deep, profound sense of justice. There's a crusader nature about it because, one, the nature of wanting to get to A to B in the most efficient way possible to get it done, whether it be, if you're coming from a regal trait, whether for the greater good for all or just to get something done. With that comes that credibility factor of truth and justice that lives in that part of them. For women, it's like the Joan of Arc to them. For men, it's like the knights in shining armor that will fight for the underdog. So it has a tendency to be a little bit confrontational by nature, especially when they're not operating in the most optimal way, right? The absorptive trait, of course, is how you recognize you're in there. It's a little bit more passive by nature. Okay, so the first two, the regal and the energetic that I talked about, they're more active. So the way that person shows up in that part, I mean, you could think of these traits as gears because we don't have just one trait, right? To be optimized, we typically like to see someone to have at least 3, kind of like, the 3 points to a plane to represent physical reality. Okay, when they say 3-dimensional reality, 3D is because of the fundamental physical law. Like, you need 3 points to determine a plane. You need 3 legs on a stool to make sure that it's stable, right? Sometimes when life is happening to us, we've seen situations where people are showing up with only 2 traits, in which case we know that we need to look at the rest of the grid to see what is going on. What's the story of what's happening? What decisions are being made where you're not showing up as optimal as you can, okay? The beautiful thing about this technology and why we encourage people to take it every 90 days, once a season, is because, like nature, human beings shift and flow biorhythmically with nature. And at the same time, it gives you an opportunity to take a snapshot of how well you're doing from one season to the next. We want people to understand that this is not a static technology. It is a living technology that is meant. So a lot of people will say, oh, wait, I haven't taken it yet. I was like, why? Because I want to wait till I'm in a better place. Why? So you can take it and feel better about yourself? No, this is a tool to help you navigate and spend less time in a not so good place. So one of the best times, and a lot of us practitioners, we do that when we're like going through something horrendous in life, we run to take the assessment to see how our ecosystem handles that. And also to be given a blueprint on how to get out of that little funk state that we're in. And that's what's so cool about this technology. When people go to the 90-day optimization plan, it is literally the game plan to create a more optimal life over the next 90 days. Or if you're in a funky place, to give you the blueprint on how to get out. Right? But going back to traits, we can think of traits like in a vehicle of a car to be like your unique gear set. What gears you have access to drive your vehicle through life, vehicle of self through life. And so one of the things that we would want to help people master is, one, get a deep understanding of what each gear does in your vehicle of self. And once you understand that, mastery comes from not just structuring your life to honor the natural top 3 traits that you go to from morning to night, but then also when life happens, knowing how to shift gears to the appropriate gear in the moment. Let's say you're in a meeting, but you're not the one leading the meeting, and there's a leader up there doing whatever the leader is doing, but then you find yourself, you're in your regal trait, which is also a leader. Well, then you're going to have those headbutting moments because you're going to try to lead the event when you're not the leader, and the other leader is like, what's going on here, right? So the mastery of self of someone who recognizes that will say, I really shouldn't be in my regal trait right now because this is not my event or my meeting to lead. I'm going to shift to, let's say, my sympathetic trait if I have access to that. And then when I shift to that, that means I could just be situational, seeing things on a situational level instead of trying to lead the moment, right? This is where we start to empower human beings to, instead of intuitively doing a shotgun approach and figuring out, okay, what do I do right now? To very clearly understand, oh, let me just go to this trait of mine without compromising myself. Because sometimes if we don't know this about ourselves, we'll shift to a trait that we shouldn't be in. And then we'll realize, why am I so tired? Why am I exhausted? Because you went to a trait that, though you may have been taught or been told to use it, it's not really authentically you. So it's taking energy away from you just to be in that trait.
Yeah, I love it. So let me read what Hai said about me as promised, because it's spot on and incredible. And then we'll move on to actually practically, how do you shift gears in the most efficient way so you don't drain your energy while you're shifting gears too, because that's another component of it. But so I just asked it, I said, what is one activity I can do today to be more optimized? Relatively simple question. And it's funny that it said this because I actually did this yesterday, but the reason is very interesting. So it says, host a mini brainstorming session with colleagues. Your regal nature makes you a natural leader, and your effervescent trait will keep the atmosphere light and engaging. It's exactly what I did yesterday, and it truly was energizing for me. I love doing that because you get to have fun. It is light, like it says with the effervescent trait, but I naturally love seeing the big picture through the lens of the regal trait. It's my biggest trait, and I think that's so cool. If I just did that today, and you ask it again tomorrow, and you do what it says tomorrow, think about the compounding effect of what 90 days could look like if you're living in the optimal version of yourself.
Yeah, and other ways that Hai has been used is like you can create more context. Like, I'm about to step into a meeting with a whole bunch of other regals. It's not my meeting to run. Knowing what my other traits are, what trait should I ideally be in the context of this upcoming meeting that is in a room full of other regals, right?
Meeting of the kings.
Meeting of the kings, right? All chiefs and no Indians type of thing, right? The reality is, we can shift gears out of that. So the idea of like, oh, all chief, no Indians. Well, that's because nobody knows how to shift out of the regal. Right? But how do you then have people lead different departments? You're going to have a whole bunch of chiefs, but chiefs who understand what gear they should be in is ideal. So there's a whole formula to shifting gears, and we have a whole thing that we teach in our retreats and our deeper dive with our clients and everything like that on how to optimally shift from one gear to the other. But what I'm going to do right now is kind of talk about the natural flow of gear shifting from one trait to the other. Okay. So that when anybody who's listening to this and is looking at their grid and say, okay, great. Well, Wei said energetics right after regal. So shifting from regal to energetic is going to be easy. Now, this is very directional. What we found is people from energetic shifting back to regal, it's backflow. It actually is extremely difficult and extremely exhausting to go from energetic back to regal. But from going to regal to energetic, it's just a step in a kind of like almost like a clockwise direction. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about the natural flow from one gear to the other, assuming like you have access to all gears, let's say. Okay, so it goes from regal to energetic, energetic to absorptive, absorptive to romantic, romantic to sympathetic, sympathetic to perceptive, and then a perceptive back to regal. Notice I didn't say effervescence.
But Wei, you left one out.
I left one out. Okay. And the reason why, remember, effervescent is the only one that isn't physically grounded in gravity. It's kind of like the centerpiece of it all. It is gaseous by nature. Think of the effervescence as the middle of that whole loop, right? And it provides easy access to every single trait. So if you happen to have effervescence, then you can bypass that order by jumping into your effervescent trait and then to the appropriate trait for the moment. For example, going back to the example that we're talking about, walking to a room, this person's a leader, I'm not a leader, so I'm in my regal, which is one of my largest traits. And I said, well, if I stay in this one, eventually I'm going to bump heads with whoever's leading this meeting, right? So I think I want to go into my sympathetic. So what I'll do is, instead of going from regal to energetic to absorptive to romantic and going through that whole entire sequence of going to each trait, okay? And what I mean by that is that you do something that represents regal, then you go do something that represents energetic, that lives in energetic. You do something that represents absorptive, then romantic, then sympathetic. Then I'm finally a sympathetic, right? Well, because I have effervescence as an authentic trait, because not everybody has this authentic trait, then unfortunately you just have to go that clockwise thing, right? Or just recognize that I'm going to be stuck in my energetic, so I just gotta understand that about myself and make sure that I'm ready to explain to people, hey, I'm just in my energetic right now. Okay.
Take a deep breath.
Take a deep breath, right? But if you do have authentic access to effervescent, remember, that's kind of in the middle of it all. You can actually shortcut. So what I do is I go from my regal, which is the benevolent king, okay, the seeing trait. I jump into my effervescent, which is kind of like where optimism lives, fun loving, it's childlike by nature. So typically do something fun, funny, be silly, whatever the case may be, which then moves me away from the regal to give me the opportunity to choose a better gear to be in, because from the effervescent trait, you can literally jump to any other trait that you have authentic access to. This is why it's so important to know what authentic traits you do have access to so you don't jump into the wrong one. So then I'll jump into my sympathetic, which allows me to be a little bit more laid back by nature, more about situational, seeing what's going on. And more importantly, just kind of being able to hold space, because it's more passive by nature. It's not as active as the regal. It's not as active as the effervescent, but it's more disarming by nature. And it's where the natural born healer lives. So it has the ability to hold space, right? Okay. If that is indeed the best place or best trait or gear I should be in that moment, depending on the context of that meeting, right? But if it's a meeting about, like, getting things done and everything like that, then maybe not that. Maybe I'll go into, the energetic trait, or maybe I'll go into the romantic trait, depending on the situation. Again, this is why mastery of these traits is like, now you've been disconnected from the matrix. Take the time to understand and experience and fine-tune your understanding and how to contextually make it relevant to the way you live your life. Right?
Yeah, I think that's been one of the more we'll say eye-opening pieces of it for me as we go further and further down the rabbit hole. And obviously we incorporate this in our company, just to be able to call somebody out, not even call somebody out, but label their behavior and be able to spot what trait they're in. So you don't actually have to get triggered by somebody. Imagine that. The world may have lied to us and said that everything's a trigger. No, not true. If you know where it lives and why you're being triggered, you don't have to react. You can just go about operating like a normal human being.
Right.
Kind of crazy.
Yeah, most triggers happen because there's a couple elements that are happening. They're triggered because of some experience of misunderstanding that you've had, and so to allow that it carries a charge, right? But there's another part of triggers that most people who have triggered, there's an element of it that lives there, is the trigger of the unknown, fear of the unknown. Unfortunately, society, culture, politics, media, whatever you want to say, academics has cultivated almost indoctrinated humanity as a whole into fearing the unknown, like to a distorted level of panic, fight or flight, or anything like that. What we don't realize is being able to embrace the unknown is what allows evolution and growth to happen. If you're growing into a new dynamic or to a better dynamic, you wouldn't want to go there if you've already been there, because that's not growing. That's just going to where you already know. Most of the time, when people don't realize, is as we get older, as we grow, we try new things and everything like that, we're literally venturing into the unknown, right? But this fear of the unknown, there's this vestige that kind of lingers. So when people get triggered, it's kind of like one of those two diamonds. It's a function of misunderstanding of something based on an experience, and then a distortion of meaning that's made. And then two, there's a little bit of an unknown factor to it. It's like, I don't know what to do about this. I don't know how to understand this. You probably start to understand a little bit more now that when you see something happening, no longer is it about, I don't know what's happening. It's more like, I wonder what trait they're in right now. And I wonder if it's an optimal expression or a less than optimal expression. And when we get into drivers, it's like, I wonder what weak state expression of that driver is, right? And you can decipher anything. And then I think you've already noticed already, anytime it's like, what is it about this? Like, the technology is so universally powerful, explains pretty much every human behavior that's out there through the lens of either a nuclear force driver or a trait characteristic or some aspect of electromagnetism or nuclear force or gravitational expression, right?
Yeah. So Wei is a tease, and he mentioned drivers. That's next episode. I promise we're gonna get there. But it's funny you say that because me and Sean, who you listening will meet very soon on this podcast, we were at an event a couple of weeks ago, and there was this one point where they had a panel on stage. It was these 4 women, and a cat fight broke out, and it was the most entertaining thing
You
I've
didn't
ever
tell me
seen.
that.
No fists were thrown. I will say that it wasn't that entertaining. But these 4 women, they were going at it, but you could so clearly tell what. I mean, I'm a little bit more trained than the general public, way less trained than you. So let's just put that out there. But you could tell based on their physical makeup what the prominent traits were, so where the natural clashes were, and then I both me and Sean were going through labeling what weak state of the drivers that we assumed they were in at the moment. And it was fascinating. The whole thing, it took on a new level of entertaining because we were like, oh, this is just weak state behavior at its finest. This is
Right.
amazing.
Yeah.
Takes reality TV to a new level too.
Yeah, it takes away the judgment and bias and name calling that could often comes from that. Like, what a bee or what a this and that, whatever the case may be. It's like, oh, that's simply the weak state behavior of, say, the accomplishment driver or something like that, right? Or that's just basically the perceptive trait in a kind of less than optimal way of just witch hunting, stuff like that. That's one of the things that you'll see. Like, if you have access to the perceptive trait and you just kind of think back to your life when you're not operating in your most optimal way, the thing about the perceptive trait, it's quick, it's fast, it's clever, it's witty, it's strategic, and it's also negatively charged by nature, meaning that it is really good at identifying what's not working. So when someone who's in the perceptive trait, and we've all seen this in each other because I have access to it, you have access to it, my sister has access to this. And then what happens is if we're having a long day and we're not doing the greatest. And I see this coming up, with, people that I care about in my life. I find myself poking at things. That's not working. That's wrong. That's wrong. That's wrong. That's wrong. I was like, ooh, I'm such a witch hunter right now. Okay, cool. And then you couple that with my energetic trait, if it's all about justice and doing things right, then it turns from a poke to a punch. And then there goes my internal, meme name that you guys have for me when I'm in that state.
That's why we call Wei the punchopotamus sometimes, but it's okay. Again, we're being objective, and he knows what that means. So we can say, Wei, you're being a punchopotamus.
Yep.
And he goes, okay, I can shift out of this. I can make this work.
So
let's
need to
end
be
the
my
episode
energetic. I
on
don't need to
that.
be perceptive. I could just go into a different trait. Yeah.
Exactly. Because you've mastered shifting gears, you've mastered the technology, but that's available for everybody. Again, it's in the app. Go ask questions to Hai. You will start to learn this stuff and master it for yourself. But let's turn this into a personal self-help podcast, because you brought up the perceptive trait. Let's talk about a real life example or potential example. So if someone has access to the perceptive trait, they're probably listening to this on a minimum of 1.5x speed. So shout out to you, because that's you.
Because that's where impatience lives. Because the perceptive trait is very quick to get what the point is.
Right? Yeah. My wife, she is a higher volume in this than I do. She listens to things on minimum 2x or sometimes 2.5x. And I'm like, that's not even, it's not English anymore. I don't know what you're listening to. I don't know how you hear it. But anyway, So that's you if you have it. But let's talk about this, because perceptive trait, yes, I do admittedly spend a lot of time there. Wei yells at me. It's okay. Same thing. I can gear shift. Naturally clashes with the slower archival processor, the absorptive trait. So real time in a meeting, for someone listening on either side of this, you know that those two traits are going to have a clash. How do we shift out of that if you're in a conversation, if you're in a meeting, or how do both sides come together to collaborate rather than
Mhm.
just be at odds with each other?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is referencing the perceptive trait versus the other processing trait, which is the absorptive trait. The perceptive trait is kind of like the Einstein's, his quote of, why should I memorize anything when I can just look it up? That's a very perceptive kind of answer, right? It's quick, it's fast, and everything like that. And I think he has a lot more of that because he's more about like Sherlock Holmesing approach of situations. They did a in his autopsy, they found out his brain was like like a quarter smaller than most normal human beings. Like, oh my God, he has a smaller brain, but he was brilliant and stuff like that. And well, he had a little bit of other things going on, like the genius, but that paired with the perceptive trait, right? The absorptive trait is a different type of processor. Yes, it is a slower processor because it is an archiver. Think of like okay, I got this book now. I got to find where to put it in the library. Give me some time. I'll be right back. And it takes time to kind of absorb and put that information together. If you can imagine, if both are not operating in the most optimal state, the absorptive will get a little bit kind of like, hey, slow down, it's too fast. And the perceptive is, let's go, and doesn't have, it's always like 3 to 5, maybe 10, sometimes 15 steps ahead of everybody else. It's like, come on, don't you get it already? And when we don't understand that, that's where resentment and frustration starts to build, because we don't objectively understand what's happening in that moment. The funny thing is, the irony of it all is, in the context of relationship, the perceptive trait and the absorptive trait are maximum attraction to each other. Their opposites attract type of dynamic. So in an optimal expression of each one, they're actually naturally attracted to each other like nature. The absorptive trait is a positively charged trait. The perceptive trait is a negatively charged trait. So if you think about magnets, there's a natural draw to each other. So in the dynamic of an optimal, kind of combination, the absorptive trait, where it has all that archive, all that wisdom necessary for the perceptive trait to very quickly solve a problem utilizing the access to that wisdom. That is like the optimal combination right there. Of course, human beings, if we're not taking care of ourselves, if we're not prioritizing ourselves, if we're putting ourselves at the bottom of the totem pole, more often than not, perceptive and absorptive, when they get together, there's a little impatience that kicks up here, and there's a little bit of like, hey, I don't understand. And then they shut down and say, I'm not going to respond until I have time to figure out what's happening, right? And then they will put the brakes on, and the perceptive will want to go, and then boom, right? And that happens a lot, because in organizations, you want people who have the wisdom. You also want people who are strategists. So you'll have a combination of a lot of that in a lot of, organizational dynamics. And when we start to understand who brings in most of the absorptive and who brings in most of the perceptive, and we can honor that, it starts to change the game altogether and how efficient organizations can operate in those unique dynamics.
So no need to shift, just a pause is what you're
Just
saying.
to understand what is happening in that moment, right? I tell people who have perceptive trait all the time, is like, it's where impatience lives, right? And one of the ways to mitigate that is to remember the tortoise and the hare story, except with a different ending, is where, like, if you find yourself getting more and more impatient, it just means you're about 5 or 6 steps ahead of everybody else. In which case, no worries about FOMO, just pause and wait for the rest of the room to catch up, or rest of the world to catch up. And unlike the tortoise and the hare story, where, like, the hare overslept, and because that's a different trait. FOMO lives big in those who have the perceptive trait. And what happens is, we just have to remember and remind ourselves that hey, no big deal. Even if the rest of the world passes us, we're so quick with the perceptive trait, we can catch up in an instant. If we embrace and understand this about ourselves and don't make meaning that, oh, we're bad. Because though the perceptive trait is quick, remember, it's negatively charged, it can actually turn it on itself. You could be hypercritical of self. You can be hyper impatient with self, which then creates this loop, this slippery slope of never breaking away from that. And so you're just going deeper and deeper into the abyss.
Right. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never done that. It's crazy.
So if you're listening to this and you do have access to that perceptive trait, then you know what I'm talking about.
Oopsie. This is awesome. I could do this all day. I know you could too, but we got to wrap this episode up because people have things to do with their lives, and that's okay. They should optimize themselves. So the prompt of the day, I'm putting you on the spot. I just thought of this 10 seconds ago, so sorry, but here we are. What do you want people to go into the app and ask hi after this episode?
So I think one of the best things to do is to gain a deeper understanding of how to master the authentic traits. Start to ask, hi, what are some of the activities that best utilize your top 3 traits? And then when you get that answer, see how you can structure your day to honor your morning, noon, and night traits, and see if you can restructure your day. Because I guarantee if you can restructure your daily living to honor those top 3 traits of yours, you're going to be more energized, you're going to be more motivated, you're going to be more productive, and you're really going to get more out of your day and ultimately your life. It's not an overnight thing, depending on how you're designed. If you have a lot of perceptive trait and a lot of effervescence, maybe it's an overnight thing. But for the rest of the world, it depends. It just depends on your vehicle self. So be patient with yourself, first and foremost. Be patient with this because it's a whole new language. But I guarantee you, it will transform your life in ways nothing else can. I've been in this human transformational game and human optimization game for over 30 years now. And it blew my mind when I came across this technology over 10 years ago. I was almost upset why it wasn't more ubiquitous then, so that I could have taken advantage of it 20 years prior. Right. But here we are
now
today.
We're very upset it's not more ubiquitous now, but we're working on it. That's why we're here. And as a bonus,
free, go get it.
Yes, please go get the app. It's down in the description down below, wherever you're watching or listening. But we'll give you a bonus too. So go prompt hi with what Wei just said. If you type in the comments wherever you're listening to this, something you are struggling with or a challenge in your own life you'd love to overcome, we will respond with a personal prompt that you can go use with hi that I promise you will help you overcome that challenge. So that's just a bonus. A thank you for listening to this episode. Either us or a member of our team will reach out and respond to that. Next episode, we're talking about motivational drivers that Wei teased. That's going to be a fun one. Strong state, weak state behavior. It's going to be fascinating. You'll see the world in a whole new light. We will see you on the next episode of Running with Scissors.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Running with Scissors. Have you downloaded the HumanOp app yet? Head over to humanop.com to experience the power of this technology for yourself. See you on the next episode of Running with Scissors.